Well, my name is Gwendolyn Moore. I am the curator of urban landscapes and community identity, and I have been at the History Museum since 2004, the second time. Well, the first time I came here, I was a research fellow, and I worked on an exhibit doing oral histories through the eyes of a child. I then worked as a programmer. I did the Urban Forum series for the History Museum, and then I went off to graduate school and came back in 2004. During the course of that research, I came across Judge Nathan B. Young, who was one of the founders of the St. Louis American newspaper and had a really keen interest in African American history, local African American history, and did a lot of research. Now, as the founder of the African American newspaper, which is the St. Louis American, he was also the editor for the next 45 years. And a lot of his editorials actually dealt with local civil rights history. I always say that his editorials are like mini history lessons. I've learned a lot about African American history just from reading his editorials. But in 1964, there was a bicentennial issue, September the 22nd, 1964. And he wrote a very long article about the contributions of African Americans to the city of St. Louis and to the nation. Not just African Americans, but he also talked about the contributions of whites who were involved in the freedom struggles of African Americans. And one of the reasons he wrote this long article is because he wanted the city of St. Louis in this celebration of the bicentennial, don't forget what we have contributed. Don't forget what African Americans have contributed. And he had this very bold headline, #1 city in civil rights, which I'm sure caught a lot of people's attention. But the interesting thing is he went on to build a very strong case to support his argument. And I was very impressed and influenced by his work.
So when you tell people about this exhibit or an article, the title #1 in civil rights, what is their first reaction?
Well, the first reaction is we didn't even have a civil rights movement. In fact, this happened in 2004 when I was talking about my work on the oral history of the civil rights movement, and there was this feeling that we really didn't have a civil rights movement. And I think it has a lot to do with the way local history is taught or is not taught in the public schools. I think it also has to do with the fact that many people think of civil rights movement as something that happened in the Deep South, beginning in 1954 and ending in 1968. And they don't think of Missouri. They think of Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and the Deep South states. But there was a civil rights movement here, a very active civil rights movement, a very rich civil rights movement. And according to Judge Young, we can date it to 1819, which is a very bold claim. And that's because we had the first civil rights demonstration on the continent when free blacks and their white allies were protesting the fact that Missouri was going to enter the Union as a slave state. So it starts there. And then he goes on to build his case. You know, he doesn't stop there. And the crux of his argument is that at least in 1964, that our contribution to the national movement was these 3 civil rights cases. That was in 1964. And the first one was 1857, of course, the Dred Scott case, which practically everyone knows, one of the most famous court cases in United States history, Supreme Court cases. But there were also the other cases. In 1938, there was Gaines versus Canada, when Lloyd Gaines sued the University of Missouri because they would not allow him to enter the law school there because he was a Negro. And then the Shelley versus Kramer case, which is when the Shelleys sued because of a restrictive covenant that tried to prevent them from living in a house they had purchased in the 4600 block of Labadie. But then again in 1968, there was another Supreme Court case, Jones versus Meyer. And so Judge Young, as he was very much focused on these civil rights cases, says, aha, not only did we have 3 civil rights cases that made it all the way to the Supreme Court, now we have a 4th one, Jones versus Meyer, in which Joseph and Barbara Lee Jones sued Alfred H. Meyer because he would not sell them a house in Paddock Woods, which is a subdivision in North St. Louis County, because Mr. Jones was a Negro. Barbara Jones was white. Now, the interesting thing about this case is that Alfred Meyer really wanted to sell them the house, but because of all these restrictions, these racial restrictions, he was prevented from doing so. He was a businessman, and he wanted to sell to everybody. And he actually helped to finance this case, secretly, of course, a case that was against him. So I thought that was really interesting, and it shows how this is not just a one-sided story. It's not about blacks fighting for their rights. That's a big part of the story. But they also had white allies from the very beginning, and there were always whites of goodwill that were involved in this struggle. This is our history. And I think the important part is just telling the story. Some of our history is problematic. Some of our history is troubling. Some of it causes elation. And it's very positive, but it's all history. And I think you have to tell the story. You have to tell the whole story, the good, the bad, the ugly. Because it is our past, and it is making us what we are today. There's the quote from supposedly from James Baldwin, who says, if you want to know what's going on around you, you have to know what's going on behind you. And it helps us to understand where we are now. If we don't understand our history, we won't understand our present, or it won't help us to look into the future. So our history is important. Like I said, I want people here to understand that we have a history we can be proud of. I mean, when Judge Young says we're number one in civil rights, I mean, that's a bold claim. When he said we have contributed so much to this national struggle, it's not just what we've done here locally, but what we've done here nationally. Every time you read about some movement here in St. Louis, like the March on Washington movement, there's a new book out about the March on Washington movement, in which the author says, who is a historian, a trained historian, he says that we had one of the most successful March on Washington movements in the country. Myron Rudwick's book on CORE talks about we had one of the most active, successful COREs in the country, the NAACP. They said under Sidney Redmond and Henry Espy, we had one of the most active NAACP chapters in the country. I don't think most people realize that. I think that this is our history and this is our legacy, and it's something that we can be proud of. And I don't think it should be ignored any longer.